Okay, good evening. Tonight we're talking about Australia as liberal capitalism as part of the history of labour. That's labour with the U in it in Australia. Last week we saw the destruction, after strongly fought resistance, of Aboriginal economic cultures in the Sydney Basin and the reduction of the people in this area to basically a state dole and informal waged work. We also saw a go-slow resistance by convict workers, which in part forced Australian capitalism to introduce free labour as the standard form of labour in New South Wales first, then in the rest of Australia. The books that I'm relying on for this week are Connell and Irving's Class Structure in Australian History, and the other books worth looking at for this week are V. Gordon Child's How Labour Governs and Noel Butlin's Economic Histories. In 1840 and still in the 1880s, Australia had a massive labour shortage, strengthening the relative powers of workers against capitalism. And I'll be saying this pretty much every week up until the 1980s. This week we look at the triumph of labour in freedom, its radical mass actions and sectoral intentional strengths in guilds and chapel unions. We see this lead towards what would become the defeat of the shearers' strike and the triumph of liberal democracy in Australia, basically the kind of parliament we're used to, except instead of every Australian citizen who is white up until 1968 having the vote, instead of that only males who meet property criteria having the vote. But it also means a number of other things about government and the state. And the accommodation of labour to this liberal democracy, and when I use accommodation, I don't mean a great desire for it, though some people had a great desire for it. I more mean you don't have to like where you live, but you still have to live there. You accommodate to it and put up and cope. We also see this week the resistance to genocide and wage labour by Aboriginal peoples in Australia and their accommodation to genocide and wage labour in Australia. And again, accommodation means putting up with and learning to live with. This week we look at the height of the genocide, where most of the southeast and most of Queensland are basically have their existing ways of life destroyed by cattle runs. Though invasion as an active military policy continues up until I think 1934. So more weeks of that too. So just as a brief theoretical introduction, I'm looking at this in terms of class composition, which means the way we live and fight with the boss; decomposition, the way they try and destroy our previous way of fighting and living; and recomposition, finding new ways to fight with the boss. It's also a history. I do history. I'm not an expert up until the mid-1930s in this area, so take 2 grains of salt here. 1, historians are wrong a lot. 2, I can be especially wrong because I'm not expert in this area.
Sorry, what was it? First point, historians
wrong a lot.
Are wrong a lot.
Okay.
History works by being wrong, and historians then catching each other being wrong. So it's part of the method. We read texts and argue about them. So, to begin with, I'd like to look at a critical issue in the genocide in Australia in 1838, which was the Mile Creek Massacre. This was really the last state-sanctioned massacre. It's one of the few massacres for which whites were arrested. It's one of the few massacres for which whites were prosecuted. I think it's the only massacre for which whites were executed by a court. This is 1838. This is after 50 years of invasion. You might think that a state would treat people living in New South Wales colony like human beings and offer them the full protection of law that was offered in the United Kingdom itself. You'd be wrong. This massacre happened 180 kilometres north of Tamworth. So we are talking by 1838, convict labour, semi-free labour, cattle being run all the way up what is now New South Wales colony, New South Wales state, then a colony. And the way in which people resisted the massacre, and I think it's worth calling what they tried to do to avoid being massacred resistance, and how they lived and accommodated with invasion, is worth considering resistance. They were dealing with people nicking their land to run cattle on it, drive off other protein-eating animals, which was a significant part of their access to diet, destroy their land management, which destroys the majority of their dietary access, restrict their cultural movements, restrict their economic restrict their use of country to sustain themselves. Economics perhaps the wrong description for people who don't have an internal class society like capitalism. I'm going to read from Wikipedia because the summary of the Mile Creek Massacre is reasonably decent there. A group of 11 stockmen, including assigned convicts and former convicts, 10 of them of European extraction, one African, John Johnston, which is worth remembering. The UK's transnational labour pool was not restricted to whites living in the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. United Kingdom, including Ireland, at the time. Led by a squatter. They arrived at a station where there were 35 Aboriginal people camped there. These were, and I'm going to completely stuff this up because I'm monoglot, Wirrayare people, part of the Camarol people. They'd been camped for a few weeks after being invited by Charles Kilmaster to come to their station for safety and protection from the gangs of marauding stockmen massacring people. These people had previously been camped at the station for a few months. They were well known. The younger men in the community were off harvesting bark, and from the Wikipedia presentation it seems like they were industrially harvesting bark for the colonial system. So these were people with an excellent relationship with the invaders who had come to some kind of general understanding before the massacres began with the invaders, including partial wage labour. And when the stockmen rode into the camp, they found the people fleeing to the local convict's hut to seek protection. They were taken 800 metres away and mostly killed by swords. Why is this worth considering as resistance? Well, first of all, these are people who have come to terms with the fact that they're not going to drive off the British. They can resist and they can fight, but they're not going to drive them off. When massacres occur, they appeal to the British society as if they are people of the society who deserve full protection at law. And their removal was deemed by the Sydney elite to be illegal, involving eventually a bunch of trials, a small number of executions. That isn't so important because the British elite fought within themselves about whether Aboriginals were human beings, about whether Aboriginal human beings were the scum of the earth who needed to be massacred on whole, what kind of policy should exist. But as you get closer and closer to London and further away from the frontier, the capitalist government treats Aboriginal people more like human beings and less like people who should be eliminated wholesale. Also, by 1838, we haven't seen a black line like happened in Tasmania, where the majority of Tasmanian Aboriginal people were murdered in a deliberate genocide which walked the territory to kill people. I think that's probably because resistance was more effective on the continent than on Tasmania. I think it's worth considering the context of why roving bands of men were going around massacring people who were integrated some way into the economy, who'd already knuckled under the fact that there's cattle on their bloody country. But after this, the reaction of white Australia is to systematically hide massacres for the next 90 years. White government in Australia would no longer tolerate non-reprisal style massacres by the state. They would no longer tolerate public non-state massacres, and state massacres had to be politicised and considered as police reprisals rather than just being free and open genocide anymore. And it's worth considering this because of the broader structure of the frontier wars, where in some areas, due to the lack of free labour, as the frontier moved through, Aboriginal people would make an accommodation with early frontier capitalism, seek continued access to country, to traditional sources of life, while also trying to scrap wage labour around the sides of life. That this isn't a rollover completely. These are people with their own life story, and they come into contact aware of what is likely to happen, fighting it off. But these kind of accommodations are not particularly nice. Resistance didn't work. We live in a white Australia today. Resistance didn't work. Aboriginal people were not incorporated as wage labourers with the full protection of law as human beings. This is the kind of accommodation that we make with the boss at work or the landlord or the bank, the one we don't particularly like but we have to live with. the one where the government can no longer massacre us freely or allow people to freely massacre us. Instead, they have to do it quietly, on the sly. Goodbye, we're going hunting, we're not bringing any animals back. Oh, what happened? Oh, nobody's complaining about the cattle being run anymore. Isn't that nice? We all know what happened. If you speak with rural people in New South Wales who are friendly and who know their family history, they're likely to tell you about their stories about this. This also is about the imposition of the dole charity system on Aboriginal people. Aboriginal people were not offered the kind of labour that free or ex-convicts were offered, of actually working. They were offered marginal labour, illegal labour, half labour, labour for truck goods, always underpaid. They were offered dole and charity. And this is a successful resistance in a way, because white Australia could have attempted to systematically starve to death Aboriginal people in its care. It's repeatedly happened elsewhere when systems come into conflict and people are put into the care of the state. Now, I'm not saying that people didn't starve to death under government care, but they were not starved to death as cultural groups, as entire communities, and not as an act of government policy, which has happened elsewhere in this kind of power disparity, which is a result of resistance in a way. So, without access to pliant, easygoing Aboriginal labour, without access to convict labour, the cattle runners, the new squatters, turned to free labour. This meant importing people or subsidising movement to Australia. These were high-wage jobs. They were jobs which were supplemented by land theft. When a capitalist gets a whole bunch of land and all they have to do is kill a number of people, you can up wages to meet labour demand on the basis of buying people off. The other factor here is that there was a promise of potentially becoming an owner-operator small capitalist, which is worth considering more on the frontier than in urban areas, largely because during this period, 1840 to 1880, the access to capitalism in Australia, to becoming a big capitalist in Australia, closed off, and access more and more to entry into the market closed off. This is where the three capitals in the period come together. We've got the herding and agricultural capital, which is profitable primarily by land theft and by booting up a new industry. We have import substitution capitalism, because it's so damn expensive to import stuff from the United Kingdom or Europe. And we also have state-based capitalism, which took over failing public-private partnership type enterprises, or occasionally ran their own production. Roads is an example of the state building roads. Railways in this period is an example of failing capitalism being taken over and then eventually run more successfully for profit. The three capitals did control government throughout the entire period. Government constantly changed throughout the entire period, and it varied between governors acting by themselves, or an elite being appointed to an upper house, or only the very rich being able to elect legislative councils if they existed at all, through to eventually universal manhood suffrage with some property qualifications in some areas over different things. And it was successful. It didn't fall over. There was no revolution that turned over this government. Workers were incorporated slowly into voting for the managers of capital who appointed themselves. Part of the other tale of change here is the difference in labour relations. At the beginning there was the Masters and Servants Act, which basically you can't get injured on the job, because if you got injured on the job it's your own damn fault your arm cut off. Because only an improperly behaving servant could choose to cut their own arm off. Difficult to renegotiate labour and pay contracts, a lot of power against the workers in this period. Union type activity was, from illegal through to heavily repressed in the period, but it still occurred. I'm going to look at four specialised industries in relation to urban and state labour, where people jumped ship, mined gold, migrated to get to specialist industries or to mine gold. First of all, I'd like to deal with a migrant group who are the Afghans. The Afghans were brought in to serve specific state functions because whites were viewed as unsuited to the climate and occupation. they were imported because they were expert at their job of managing camels and eventually became expert labourers. These were patriarchal families where the males work and control the family, which is a theme which comes up on and off in Australian working class life. And I just want to note that that kind of long distance trade is quite significant because of the distances involved in Australia. Not raw miles, but time distances. So there are only some ways you can move some things to some areas, so you need to bring in experts. And the Afghans, despite being underpaid because they weren't British, were still paid as if they were skilled workers in a certain sense. You could only get the job really if you knew how to move camels. The second specialised industry I'd like to look at very briefly, which we discussed to some extent last week, is, it's worth calling it slavery, Chinese slavery. So Chinese people who came to Australia included people who got jobs and laboured like the rest of us, but it also included long-distance business networks and store owners or Chinese capital market bankers, specialised because of the ethnic relations with China. People imported from China as slaves were imported from ethnic minority areas. We're talking the same thing Carolyn Chisholm did with British people. Orphans, unwed mothers, the poorest daughter of the poorest poor, sold on for export, as it was in the United Kingdom, and brought here. And I've been informed that this kind of Chinese slavery was time limited and debt based rather than being forever and ever, and in your body and in your children's bodies forever and ever and ever. These are people working as marginal family wage labourers. So they are laundries, stocking, rag trade, prostitutes. It's worth mentioning because it was time limited. Blackbirding wasn't, which is the stealing of Melanesian people to bring them to Australia to work as slaves for British people. It's a hell of a lot nicer than the convict system and child importation from England, because it often happens through kind of a friend of a friend of a friend of an ethnic mate from a different family. There was more of a responsibility rather than dumping orphans to become wives, servants, prostitutes, manual labourers. It's also a hell of a lot better than systematic genocide. So the depiction of enslaved Chinese workers, which has been present in the British imagination of Chinese workers in Australia, sweeps a lot under the carpet about British labour relations, which is why it's worth mentioning. It's also worth mentioning because of the exclusion of Chinese people from importing to Australia, and it was considered on an import basis. Bodies per ship count, bodies per tonnage count on ships. Meanwhile, British labourers were being imported with government bonuses. And Chinese people who made it to Australia and started working or acting as capitalists in Australia participated more or less in the same kind of economy as other people living in Australia. Even if racially persecuted, underpaid, they weren't excluded from the economy when they got here. The other specialised industries are mining communities, which often came over wholesale and brought existing chapel relationships. So a chapel is basically a guild on a single work site or a union on a single work site. It's got strong religious, family, community connections. It has strong connections underground where the fight against the boss is localised and about, is this seam going to collapse on us? Are we going to get a good seam next week because we get paid on a for-profit basis, tons out of the mine? There was a demand for suffrage from these communities, for access to liberal democracy, but it wasn't the same kind of access to liberal democracy being demanded at times by Aboriginal people, protection of their physical being as a human being. This is more a demand of access to liberal capitalism as suffrage as a way to defend militants that exist separate to suffrage. So they were willing to fight the boss, but prohibitive laws stopped particular ways of going about it. The other specialised industry is construction, urban construction. Sydney goes up in this period, up and up and up. Melbourne goes up and up and up and up and up overnight. there was loads of construction work. There was a labour shortage. Construction involves highly skilled work. This was pressure that workers could apply to the boss on individual work sites and stop their daily profit, their weekly profit, their time payments. This is where the 8-hour day was first won by skilled workers in Australia for a skilled elite in 1859 in Melbourne. So this is one of the births of the Australian labour movement in skilled communities like coal, like construction, where workers have yet even more of a labour shortage they can apply, where they've got a skill they can withhold, where they can apply this power to the employer, even if it's illegal, even if they're using master-servant, even if they're bringing in police or military force. This is also the period where we start to get a business cycle in Australia of boom and bust and boom and bust and boom and bust. So it isn't always one-sided. There were massive periods of unemployment. People had to shift between industries. But the long-going labour shortage continues. People ate more meat in Australia than they did in England. And when you are living on potatoes in Ireland, meat in your diet sounds great. It is a noticeable standard of living increase. In effect, a wage difference. Even though wages might seem to be kind of the same, a wage comprised of potatoes and a wage comprised of meat are very different lived experiences. The next bit I'd like to talk about is gold mining as an example of a mass industry. So we all know that there was a great boom in precious metals mining through Victoria and through rural New South Wales. What I'd like to talk about here is the state was... All these people were owner-operators, right? But they're owner-operators like the plumber with one truck and one apprentice. They live off their work. They're effectively in a wage structure, if not actually a waged employee of somebody else. It's all surface mining, and the government has a ticket system for access to mining, which is the employer's profit tax, more or less, apart from the trade system in gold. The state is also the repressive arm of labour discipline. This isn't a workplace where there is a foreman and HR and a right-wing union that does the boss's willing. This is a labour system where people get up, eat, mine, pay government tax, try and sell the gold they make on, get drunk, go home. Don't do it the next week or do it without a ticket next week, get their heads beaten in by state military police. The two incidents that I really want to talk about here are Eureka and Lambing Flats. They are very different incidents. Eureka is a multi-ethnic revolt against the mining ticket system that incidentally demanded universal suffrage and a democratic parliament. You know, they wanted the government out of their pockets because the government was the expression of the employer. And the side issue, the way to get it, the government runs the military, the government runs the tickets, the government's the employer, kick out bloody government, replace it with an employer of our own. So that's the radical democratic aspect. And this is universal manhood suffrage stuff. This is yearly parliamentary election stuff. This is not, well, maybe people who earn so many pounds a year can vote for somebody in a parliament every 5 years stuff, which is how a lot of Australian parliaments ended up. And what's worth talking about the multi-ethnic status here, the Irish have moved on from being effectively a racial underclass by this time into being an ethnic minority with a weird religion who are strongly repressed. They're starting over this period to build their own skills via the church, which is another repressive institution, to build their communities outside of Protestant control to get free of mandatory church service at Church of England churches, which happened prior to this period. They aren't quite British, but they aren't the black Irish completely distanced. They start to be incorporated, a process which ends in the 1960s. Lambing Flats in New South Wales is completely different to Eureka in that it's a highly racial, anti-Chinese situation. Britishness is anti-Chinese. The lines are drawn as racial lines by the Australian working class. And this is one thing we need to think of in the history of our class. We are not good people, we are not bad people. We are the people we have been. And people have seen racism and the exclusion of Chinese, whether it's demanded from below by workers or demanded from above, as I think in this period the Chinese importation laws were demanded from above But plenty of workers go, that's nice, that's the kind of law I'd like to keep Chinese people out of Australia. So we shouldn't view ourselves as a purity movement of only especially good, nice workers. We have been the Tony Abbott supporting arseholes from the beginning. We have been the people who have supported the nicest possible parliamentarian you can think of from the beginning. We have been the people who want to abolish Parliament from the beginning. We as a class have been all these things. But as a mass industry, mining did not have the traditions that construction had or that underground coal mining had. It didn't have the skill power that underground coal mining or construction had. It didn't even have the labour shortage, the extreme labour shortage of working on the frontier, which was an awful place to work, that the frontier had. These mass industries did not have union traditions. They tried to build them up. They tried to build them up in shearing, in cattle running, in the black factories where mostly women worked in darkness in Sydney and Melbourne on a really pre-modern model, early factory type industrialisation. Ununionised to begin with, unions difficult to build, with foremen riding over your shoulder, with a master and servant act meaning you lost that arm, your bloody fault. Only bad workers who disobey instructions lose arms in machinery. They also had no union elites holding them down. They had no Labour parties holding them down. They had no elites writing in the Sydney Morning Herald about what workers want next year. They didn't really have the penetration that the Liberal Party has through its various organs, or the friends of the Liberal Party, in what workers should want next year from the next Liberal government. They had their own closed communities of workers, which resulted in more and more and more strikes, run up on a wildcat way, with small unions that fell over overnight when they lacked the strike funds or when depression hit and they all got sacked and the union fell apart. And the stronger unions in the period stayed running and continued, and in fact ran up cash chests like today. And in the weak unions and in the weak areas, the workers were abandoned to their fates under the bosses. But they were truly abandoned to their fate. Woolworths did not take money out of your paycheck and give it to a union you've never voted for. There was a certain freedom in this unpoliced state. And next week we'll start looking at the shearers' strike as an example of a defeat of this. But it was defeated. When the shearers' strike was defeated, most people felt, well, it's not worth killing a policeman over. I suppose the government was right in its own way. We have rule of law. Some of us can vote. Some of us might even be able to vote for somebody we might consider is great to vote for. More on that next week when we deal with the foundation of the ALP. But the defeat of this period by the creation of more legal unions, by the creation of a labour movement deeply tied into nationalism and British Empire in its officialdom and bureaucracy, a labour movement that could get careerist bastards elected to Parliament who'd instantly betray it, is the way that this spontaneous kind of unionism and the particular skilled unions had that freedom and power unravelled that they'd won. So I just want to briefly talk about what we won. And I'd like people to consider and perhaps talk about whether these were actually victories or not. We won the right to organise at work, even if it was still illegal. We put limits and contracts on the employer despite master and servant. Master and servant became more and more a dead letter as fighting happened over it. We kind of got a nationwide splintered, well-funded bunch of particular teeny tiny unions in specialist sectors. I mean, they were well-funded enough to put up Trades Hall in Victoria. You know, think about how expensive that building would have been at the time to put up. Sandstone. Lots of skilled labour. 8-hour-day skilled labour in construction. Really expensive. We won the idea of 8-8-8. 8 hours work, 8 hours play, 8 hours sleep. As an idea. Didn't win it in many industries, won it in as an idea, an aspiration. We won liberal democracy and freedom of speech. We won the right, if you were a man of a certain property qualification, growing smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller over time, to elect the people who would stuff us over. That's a win. That is a win compared with unelected governors sent solely from Britain with military power to do whatever they liked. It's a win. Not a great win, it's a win. We won the removal of the state registration of labour, like the mining ticket system in most industries. We won the government not enforcing a tax for the employer, like was happening in gold mining. We kind of won the demilitarisation of labour regulation. They stopped having swords and rifles. They started having pistols and clubs. That's a win! Do you know how many fewer people you can kill with a club? Swords are easy to kill with. You know, this is a win. We won the exclusion of Chinese from mass labour. That's a win for some of the working class, for most of the working class. Because most of the working class is British and feels that nationalism. Some of us, some Indigenous Australians in the southeast areas and in the areas of closer settlement, won the expectation that genocide through mass massacres wouldn't continue too long after they'd happened illegally, in front of the frontier, behind the frontier, after their economic life after their reproduction of their social cultural life was destroyed entirely, and they might get a little bit of illegal pay, and they would be given a dole enough to starve slowly on, not starve over 6 weeks and die on kind of deal. And they won the ability to maintain a semblance of culture in concentration camps run by the church or do-gooders or the white people in town who tolerated the shanty town outside of town. That's a win. In Tasmania, they didn't win that. So it sounds good. Sounds great. It's a win. Lots of people murdered, land stolen, democracy. We all love democracy as we know it here. But this is a win compared to military government. This is a win compared to, your own fault if you lose your arm, you can't renegotiate a contract ever in your life. We won the right to have unions. We won the rights to the most basic forms of organisation, even if most of them were semi-legal. But most of all, we'd proved that we could have aspirations like an 888 day. We proved that we would put up monuments to our own power, like Trades Hall Council in Victoria. We proved we'd organise and fight. We'd proved that we'd organise and fight no matter how they tried to buy us off. They stopped importing Chinese labour, and British labour in Australia still fought. It might have been very satisfying for way too many British labourers in Australia, but it still stopped. Next week, betrayed by our own, betraying our own, fighting against betrayal by our own, fighting for a vision of Labor without bosses. It's our party and we need to cry because we want to. Next week we're going to look at the failures of the major strikes, and we're going to look at the foundation of the ALP, the Victorian Socialist Party, a bunch of other small socialist parties of the like, and we'll lead on to the birth of a coherent Labor movement, a labour movement of unions, not united unions, but unions, outside and aligned and kind of in bed with the ALP, kind of and kind of not. But next week we're going to look at what we did when we could finally do something as a group. And I would love suggestions about what to do in week 13 about where to next. I think that we're close enough to many of the experiences we've lived to start thinking about what you want me to talk about when we start talking about where to next. So thank you. That's the recording over. I think I ran how long over time? Maybe 10 minutes. Oh God, I'm so sorry everybody. Thank you. The video... Hold it.